So today we're going to be, or this evening, depending on where you're joining from, we're going to be talking about practicing self-compassion in challenging times. That may be the one thing we can all agree on in this moment, is that these are challenging times. Okay. So before we embark on this journey, I want to talk about a few things I already mentioned, but I'll repeat that there's a link to a live transcript in the chat. So if that's something you'd like to make use of, feel free to. Hopefully that will work out for everybody. And as I mentioned as well, you're only able to send chats to me, and that's because I'm not able to moderate it right now. And so I just wanted to keep everybody safe. And I may not see your chats immediately, but I welcome them. And there also should be a way for you to ask questions with the Q&A. So we may have time for that at the end, just depending on how this goes. And I already got a confirmation that the audio and video is coming through. So thank you for that. Okay, so before we get really started, I want to talk about some expectations, set some expectations for this session. So people are joining from all over the world for this session, which is amazing, especially during these times where I, for one, often feel disconnected, but it's interesting that tools like this can actually make us feel connected. So you may not see them because, again, it's a webinar style, but there are other people here, and I know that they're joining from different countries, and so thank you all for being here. And I want to acknowledge that there's so much going on in the world, and everybody is suffering in unique ways, and so I want to hold space for that. And thank you for joining, and just keep that in mind as we go through this, is that some of the content may not resonate with you because you're going through different things, but that there may be elements that you can draw on. And I also want to make it clear that this session is not meant to be about burying our heads in the sand to ignore all of these problems that are going on in the world. That's the furthest from the goal here. The point of self-compassion is actually to develop the resilience that we need so that we can handle the things coming at us, and so that we're able to be of service to others. So I just want to make that clear. That's often a misunderstanding about these sorts of practices, and so I wanted to make that clear. And I sort of mentioned this already, but these are practices that I've found useful in the work that I do with tech companies and in individual coaching, but it doesn't work for everybody, right? So take what serves you, release the rest. If at any time you'd like to sign off because my voice is getting annoying, or you're not liking the way this is going, you are always free to do that. And that indeed is an act of self-compassion. So that is power that you have. I also want to make it clear that we will not be solving all the world's problems in this 45-minute session. We won't even be able to solve all your individual problems. And I'm sorry, I wish we could. This is really just a beginning, and so I want to make that clear, and I'll provide some resources for continuing. Okay, and then we're also going to focus on what we have control over, our thoughts and actions. So I mentioned that because a lot of the times the reason we need to practice self-compassion is because of these big social issues that also need to be addressed. And so in this session, we're going to focus more on the individual things we can do, but just know that that's so that we're able to have the strength to pursue these bigger changes. So keep that in mind too. And then finally, I just want to make it clear I'm not a therapist. So in case that's what you were looking for, you'll want to look elsewhere. Okay. So the souvenirs that will be offered on this journey today: a basic understanding of self-compassion, because as I said, it's a brief session, so we're just going to get to know it a little. And then a set of techniques for practicing it to manage stress and prevent burnout, manage burnout, etc. And hopefully some inspiration to continue this exploration beyond this session. Because as I said, we're going to be planting seeds, but to continue, we'll need to cultivate those over time. Okay, so for the journey ahead, we're going to be talking about what self-compassion really is, why we might want to embrace it, and then how we practice it. And that's the overview. So your travel buddy today is me. So I'm a software engineer who teaches emotional intelligence to people in tech. This is a picture of me with my first love here, a computer that my dad brought home from work. We couldn't afford to buy a computer, but there were some old computers, and so he got a leftover one, and that was my introduction. I think in this picture, I don't know, it kind of looks like I'm trying to marry the computer, which maybe is, was progression as far as the future, but anyway. Okay, So I also want to say that I am immensely grateful to spiritual teachers, philosophers, authors, and activists throughout the ages who have inspired and touched my life and work. And so, none of this is fresh April Wenzel content, created solely by me. It's all inspired by the history of the world and all of the people contributing. And so I just want to acknowledge that people from multiple cultures all over the world as well that have informed my work. So, and what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm grateful to them. Okay, so I want to start with this motivating quote here from a book that I've been talking about a lot on Twitter because I think it's a good guide for this time that we're in. So all things are connected deeply. In ways big and small, we are all responsible for contributing to systemic change where change is due. But to contribute effectively, to have a foundation to manage that at all, and to sustain ourselves for the long haul, we must tend to our own selves in parallel. So I think this is just something to keep in mind because I know a lot of the people here care deeply about a lot of things, and that's wonderful. And I think in addition to that, we want to care about ourselves. And so that's the motivation behind this session. I also love this quote by Alice Walker, which is, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. And I say that because, as I mentioned, there are larger issues at play here, but something to remember is that we also always have this personal power inside to have influence over our reaction to events and what we decide to do about it. And so that's our personal power, and that itself cannot be taken away. And I think that that can be important to remember. Okay. So now into the steps of the journey. So first of all, what is self-compassion? So I came to learn about self-compassion through the work of Kristin Neff, and her work is inspired by the Buddhist tradition of practicing compassion and directing it towards the self. So she says that instead of mercilessly judging and criticizing yourself for various inadequacies, shortcomings, self-compassion means you are kind and understanding when confronted with personal failings. So it's basically the opposite of how we might tend to react to things, which is to beat ourselves up when we make mistakes and give ourselves a hard time because that's what we've been trained to do. Self-compassion is the opposite of that. It's like, actually, we're going to be kind to ourselves in this moment, even if we've made a mistake. Another way of looking at it, a cute way of looking at it, is self-compassion is an alternative to beating ourselves up. It involves relating to ourselves as we would a friend or a beloved animal. And so I show this picture because maybe even looking at it will soften your heart a little bit. And that's the goal here, is that we relate to ourselves with that softness. And if that makes you kind of cringe, don't worry, we're getting to objections to self-compassion in a minute. So for the skeptics, hold on a minute, we're going to get to you. Okay, so why might we want to embrace self-compassion? Since I just mentioned skeptics, let's talk about this first. Why wouldn't we embrace self-compassion? So what could be the potential downsides here? Well, some people might think that self-compassion is selfish. As I mentioned, we have all these problems in the world. And we're talking about taking care of ourselves. Isn't that kind of selfish? So a response here is that caring for ourselves builds up our capacity to care for others. Because if we're worn out from our own exhaustion, then we're not going to be able to hold space for the suffering of others because it's going to be too much to deal with, and we're just not going to be able to do it in the long run. And a quick personal story on this: earlier this summer, I did not practice this, okay? I did not practice self-compassion for a period of time. There were a couple of days where I literally didn't eat or sleep. I was just obsessively checking the news, checking to see what's going on. And I was of use to no one. Because so not only was I exhausted and not really doing anything productive or helpful, but in addition to that, I was unable to be there when I was trying to for my friends. So I was having a conversation with a friend, and I was using the wrong words, and my words weren't coming. And and I was trying to be kind and helpful, but I was not in a place to do that because I had neglected caring for myself. And there were so many external confirmations of how this was not the right thing for me to do. That is, neglect myself. I wasn't moving my car because, like I said, I was just sort of in this anxious state of just checking the news and doing like literally nothing else. I wasn't even showering, TMI, but it's true. And my car because I was leaving it and was neglecting it, got infested with mice in the engine housing. And so I had to get that taken care of. And so there were just all these consequences, alarm bells that were like, hey, April, it's okay to take care of yourself. And so if you need to hear that, you know, that's here it is. You have permission to take care of yourself, because otherwise you're not going to be able to help yourself. You're not going to be able to help others. So, okay. Another objection to self-compassion. Self-compassion will make me weak, right? It sounds like this soft thing. People often say that about everything I talk about, but that's okay. Softness can be good sometimes. But I don't agree with this idea that self-compassion will make you weak, because self-compassion builds resilience, which is actually inner strength needed to confront life's challenges. So the idea here is that when we, instead of beating ourselves up and kind of keeping ourselves down and feeling weak, self-compassion helps boost us up and actually helps us feel stronger, so that, when all of the unpredictable things in the world happen, we're able to rise to the occasion. So it's actually it's a source of strength. Okay. So another potential objection is that self-compassion means letting myself off the hook, right? And again, this is a misconception. So with self-compassion, we can admit mistakes without feeling that they make us bad. So, and this is really important as we try to grow, and especially as we think about how we interact with others in the world, is that it's important to be able to admit mistakes without over-identifying with them and getting into a shame spiral, because again, then you get to that place where you're not really able to help anyone or yourself. And so self-compassion helps you say, yes, I'm a fallible human being and I will make mistakes, and I can take responsibility for that and make amends where I can. But that doesn't have to mean that I drown in shame and, feel horrible about myself. So that's the distinction here. Okay. Another misconception is that self-compassion will hold me back. And actually, one of the questions that came in was related to this, about how do you balance self-compassion and ambition? And we'll talk a bit more about this later. But self-compassion involves pursuing goals aligned with our purpose. It's just that we're motivated by love rather than fear. And again, that probably sounds soft, but the idea here is that part of self-compassion is knowing what really matters to you and then taking actions in line with those values, which helps you achieve those goals, which helps you, have that ambition, so to speak, if we want to use that word. It's just the idea that it's not motivated by this fear of failure, because a lot of us walk around motivated by fear, and self-compassion provides this alternative. So we're not afraid of failing. We're more as a way of loving ourselves, loving the world, loving the contribution we can make. We come from that place of self-compassion and then create goals that are aligned with our values and purpose. And so that's the distinction there. And we'll get in a little bit more to the ambition side in a bit. Okay, so those are potential objections. Now, what are the benefits of self-compassion? So here are some, and this comes from research. There's been, like I said, self-compassion as a practice and compassion as a practice has been around for millennia, right? But modern, society has started to do scientific studies to show, oh yeah, this thing that a lot of people have found value of for millennia, here's why scientifically it's good. I think that can be useful. But that said, a lot of people have been getting value from this before it was scientifically, validated. So when it comes to these sorts of practices, I often encourage people to try them and see if they benefit you, rather than relying on a study that will say 100% this is the solution, you should do it, because even those studies are a subset of people, and so they don't apply to everybody. So anyway, that said, some of the research has confirmed that self-compassion can help us find more happiness in life, a greater life satisfaction, greater resilience, reduced anxiety and depression, improved relationships, and better health. And so there's more on this in a book that's been really useful to me, the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook by Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer. And I'll include that in a list of resources at the end. Okay, so now that we've talked about what it is, why we might want to practice it, let's talk about how we practice self-compassion, getting into the center and the heart of this talk, really. So an initial step is just mindfulness. Now, this word has become almost a buzzword, and almost, it's sometimes confusing to people. It's kind of got a lot of different meanings for different people. But for the sake of this, we're really talking about just staying present in the moment to what's happening, rather than getting caught up in thoughts and other distractions. So for example, you can be mindful while you're doing the dishes. If you're just really focusing on doing the dishes, not thinking about what you're going to do afterwards, not thinking about, what happened this morning earlier, you're just focused on doing the dishes. And so like that's a way to practice mindfulness. So that's what we're talking about in this sense. And the way it intersects with self-compassion is, one, it gives us a little bit of distance to get awareness of what's going on inside ourselves and in the world around us. And it also helps us process our emotions. So the first step in it really is just slowing down. And so the reason there's a picture of a bicycle here is I gave a talk at a company, and afterwards somebody gave me this great story that they were reminded of by the talk, because I talk a lot about slowing down, because in tech, we're always going really fast. So they said they heard this great analogy, and they didn't say where they heard it. So if anybody knows if this is like some famous story that I need to give credit for, let me know. I looked for it online, but I couldn't find anything. But anyway, so it's this idea, this analogy that, if you're holding your bicycle and walking down the street, you have this momentum and you keep moving. But if you took the time to to stop for a moment and then hop on the bicycle, then you would have the power of the bicycle to move a lot more quickly. And so it's this idea that many of us in tech especially are afraid to slow down because we have this momentum. But the truth is that sometimes when we stop, slow down, we're able to take some action that helps us go faster, or at least be more efficient and effective in the long run. And so that's the essence of that story. And I really like that, because I think that's a good point, because you could make the argument, well, I don't want to stop, I want to just keep going. But it's like, well, if you do stop, you get to go a lot faster and a lot more efficient. So okay, so here's a little example that we can do. And again, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to, right? You're an adult. It's your choice, and you have all the abilities needed to make this choice. So, but if you are willing to do this, if you'll join me, it's just a quick one. But just for a moment, if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes, and we'll do a quick breathing, and then we'll do a mindfulness check-in. And I will say, before we get to totally do it, is that some people get overwhelmed more so when they try to quiet their mind. So if that's you during this part, feel free to walk around or do what you need to stay comfortable so that you don't feel too activated, okay? But for those of you who want to participate, close your eyes, or at least soften your gaze in front of you. And then what we're going to do is just take a breath first. So we're going to breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, and breathe out for 4 counts. And we're going to do it a few times. So I'll walk you through it. So breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, breathe out, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, breathe out, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. One more time. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4, breathe out, 2, 3, 4, hold, 2, 3, 4. Okay. You can open your eyes if you did close them. Now that's just to drop into the moment, to relax a little bit. Okay. And the next step in the exercise, we're going to walk through our senses and notice our environment using those senses. And if any of the senses are not ones that you want or are able to access right now, feel free to use some of the other ones that are mentioned, any of them. But I'll walk through all 5 of them, and you can use the ones that are meaningful to you. Okay, so we'll start off just by looking around the room and observing, and just notice what you see in your room right now, wherever you are. And just take a moment without judging it, without looking at that pile of dishes. Not saying I have one. No, looking at the pile of dishes and thinking, oh, I need to clean it, but just observing. Oh, there are some dishes. Oh, there's a computer. Oh, there's a chair. So take a moment first with that. And then you might close your eyes for this one, just to zero in. But close your eyes again and pay attention to what you can hear. And I'll be quiet for a second, but just pay attention to what you hear in your surroundings, whether it's distance, whether it's distant, whether it's close in, just the sound of your own breath. Just pay attention to what you can hear in this moment. Okay, you can open your eyes again. Now we're gonna think about touch. So see what you can reach out and touch on your desk. And again, remember, for any of these, use the senses that are most meaningful to you. But see what you can touch on your desk and just feel it without judging it. Just feel it. You can touch your own hand if you've got nothing else to touch. Just notice it. Okay. Now next, you might notice what you can smell. And this can sometimes be a tricky one because there's not always something to smell in our immediate surroundings that's very strong, which can sometimes be a good thing. But if you have any personal scents on that you want to smell, you might smell that, or maybe there's food cooking or coffee, or maybe you have a beverage. Just smell for a second. Okay. Now we'll end with taste. And again, this one can be tricky, but if you're drinking anything, or if you just ate something or something like that, you might be able to taste something. You don't have to tell anyone what it is. So if it's not good, if you haven't brushed your teeth yet or something, that's okay too. Just don't judge, just see what you can taste. Okay. Now the point of this exercise is, again, to drop you in the moment and to sort of, maybe when you were doing those mindfulness exercises, you were forgetting about everything else going on in the world just for a moment. And again, this is not about burying our head in the sand permanently. It's to get a little bit of distance so that maybe we can breathe a little bit more easily. Oh, someone shared something lovely, which is they have a kitten on their chest and purring loudly. So there's lots of senses involved. That's really lovely. I wish I was so lucky. Thank you for sharing that. So that's the point of that exercise. And so that's just mindfulness in general with the senses. And so we can bring that same awareness to our emotions. So if we practice when we're feeling a little bit less activated, it makes it easier to access that mindfulness when we are feeling more activated. So when we are feeling difficult emotions, I try to avoid calling them negative emotions because I think there's space for all of our emotions. But whenever we're feeling challenging emotions, difficult emotions, we can stop to notice and accept what's going on. And if we name it, sometimes that can help create enough distance so that the emotions aren't leading us completely without any sort of control on our part, but more that we take a step back and, oh, I see that I'm feeling angry right now. And again, it doesn't make you immediately calm to feel this mindfulness, but if you can produce even a little bit of separation, it will help you manage the situation moving forward and decide how to act on this anger or sadness or stress, whatever it is that you may be feeling. Just that pause. And you can do that square breath that we did, that where you breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, release for 4 counts, and hold for 4 counts. It's like a square of 4. That's the idea with it. And that can help you drop in and take a step back. So again, like I said, our difficult emotions are useful because they point to unmet needs. I just put out a blog post recently about how we can use our anger for good. And, there's tons of books on this and writing on this, and it's an important issue. And so these are not bad emotions. Anger can be good and useful, and there's space for it. So I also want to say, in the context of everything going on, that it's important to give yourself space to grieve. And I'm not going to dwell on this right now just because I'm not able to support you on an individual level as you go through this right now, but I think it's important for you to find a time, to set aside time if you feel that you've felt a loss. And I think that's likely to be everyone, because we've all lost something in this time, even if it's just our old routine or a sense of certainty or a sense of security, whatever it is. And I think it's important to grieve whatever you've lost, big or small, so that if you can process it and work through it. And a lot of people I've heard from a lot of people who feel like they don't deserve to grieve because other people have been dealing with something worse. And my heart goes out to you no matter what you've been dealing with. And I know, given the range of people here, that some of you may be going through, just extreme situations. And my heart goes out to you and to everybody, no matter what you're going through. And so I think it's important to give yourself that space. It's important too to provide a support for yourself to go through it. Resources, I find it useful to go out in nature. I feel supported. I live alone and I spend a lot of time alone. And so nature has been really helpful to me to avoid feeling totally isolated as I grieve my own losses. Journaling is a tool that I use a lot. I have like 3 different types of journals. I journal morning pages, which is just to get anxiety out. I started a bullet journal, but I just call it a planner because we have enough bullets in the world. And then I have a gratitude journal that I keep at night. And so I use a lot of journaling. And then you can speak with friends, therapists, books can be useful. I consider a lot of books my good friends because they're there for me when I need them to. Anyway, so I just want to say this because your emotions matter too. And again, it's not about saying that your suffering is the same as someone else's or it's more important. It's just like there's room for us all to grieve, and there's room for us all to feel compassion for ourselves so that we can feel compassion for others. Okay, so another element of self-compassion here that goes along with this is our self-talk. So how do we talk to ourselves when we make mistakes? And so our default is to beat ourselves up a lot of times. And that's because we're under this high stress society where there's a lot of high expectations for us. And if we mess up, we feel like total failures and we beat ourselves up. And we can get into a shame spiral. And so I'll share another quick story, which is that, to get through the stress of everything going on, and especially earlier on in the pandemic, I found myself falling back into a lot of habits that I thought I had left behind. So self-destructive things and habits that maybe feel good in the moment, but ultimately are not great for me. So I was eating a lot of comfort foods, which is something that, I've done in the past to cope with difficult emotions. And again, there's nothing bad about that. And I don't judge myself for that. But I could, right? And so the idea is if I was like, oh, April, I can't believe you're doing this again. You already figured out how to, not do these self-destructive patterns, and now you're doing them again, and you're such a failure, and you're broken, and you're a bad person. And I could get in this spiral, and believe me, I do sometimes, and I have had to work through that. But self-compassion, the self-compassionate alternative to that is to say, oh, April, wow, like you're going through a tough time right now. And so you're seeking comfort where you can find it. And that's okay in this moment, as long as, you know what I mean? Because you're not hurting somebody. If you were hurting somebody, that'd be a different issue, but I'm not, directly hurting myself either. I may, want to make different choices down the line, but in this moment, I can feel compassion for myself for why I'm doing this, engaging in this behavior that I don't really want to do in the long run. But that compassion helps me avoid getting defensive and allows me to make maybe better choices in the future. And I say better in the sense of ones that support my health long term. And again, like I said, I'm not judging what I did or anybody who's engaging in whatever you are to get through this. Again, as long as you're not hurting people. But the point is that if I were to get in that shame spiral, how do I comfort myself in a shame spiral? But probably doing more self-destructive things, and then you just get in this loop of like, and it's just never ending. And so self-compassion can help interrupt that and say, you know what, you're going through a tough time, so it's understandable why you're making these choices, and just stay curious about it. Like, why am I doing this, and what am I really needing underneath? Like, if I was really needing comfort, are there other ways that I can access comfort that maybe are more supportive of my long-term goals and that sort of thing? And so that's the idea with self-compassion, is that it doesn't stop us from making different choices or, taking responsibility, but it stops us from using up energy, like needlessly beating ourselves up, which takes a lot of energy. Okay. So, I've shared this in talks before because a lot of times, especially people in tech, are not great, are not, I don't want to say great, that's kind of judgmental, but are not, it doesn't come naturally, this idea of self compassion. So I pulled yet another list of fresh commits that where they say, I'm an idiot. And this is code commits. So for people who are not in the land of code, these are messages that go along with changes in the code we make to explain why we did them or what's in them or that sort of thing. And so these just say, I'm an idiot over and over again. And, sometimes these are meant in sort of a self deprecating kind of, humorous way. But this sort of self talk can take its toll over time. And so we want to be careful about the things we're saying in our heads because we can start to believe them. And I just want to add another note here, which is that, using this term idiot is often considered an ableist term. And so it's best to avoid in general. I'm using this here to illustrate a point, but there's other reasons not to use this sort of language as well. Okay, so let's do another exercise here, which is practicing self-talk. So think about the last time you made a mistake and try to avoid picking anything severe that you're still healing from, because again, we don't want to deal with any sort of trauma right now, though, because I don't want to activate that or anything. And so because I can't provide individual care, try to pick something, it's a minor mistake that you just, kind of messed up. So for example, I was having salsa the other day. I don't know why I keep sharing all these embarrassing things. I guess it's just to show that, sometimes vulnerability can be useful. But I was having salsa the other day and I didn't put the cap back on all the way and I had it on the counter. And then I lifted it up by the cap. And because I didn't put it on, it just the glass fell and shattered salsa all over my kitchen and it splattered the wall. It was kind of creepy. It reminded me of those crime shows where there's just, anyway, salsa everywhere. And I was just broken glass everywhere. And it's you can't even sweep it because it's got all the salsa still in it. It was a huge mess. And at the moment I was just I'm such, that was just such a silly thing for me to do to not put the cap back on. I may have used harsher language, but I'm trying to spare you that. And so that's an example of the sort of mistake we're talking about. Okay. And then think about how you talk to yourself in that moment. Okay. So I'll give you a second where I'm not talking for you to think about this. Okay. Okay. So again, this is private, so you can keep it to yourself. But if you would like to share, just again, the chat only comes to me in this case. If you send it to panelists there. So, but probably, unless you're very adept at self-compassion already, maybe the way you talk to yourself in that moment might have included some unkindness. Maybe, I don't know. I know mine did with the salsa incident. So now think about if a friend had done something very similar to what you did. How would you talk to them in that moment? So if my friend came over and was visiting and dropped the salsa, I'd be like, oh, no worries. I didn't really like that salsa anyway. Or I don't know. And actually I didn't. That's part of why I had it on the counter out because I wanted to throw it out. But or I might say, oh, no worries, I'll go get the broom. Or, or you know what I mean? We might just have some friendly sort of exchange about it. I definitely wouldn't say how could you do that? That was so rude. You're such an idiot or anything like that. Definitely wouldn't say that. So think about in your situation, what would you have said to your friend in that moment? Had they made a similar mistake to what you made? I will say it can be helpful to write these things down. Just to help slow our brain down enough to do it if you are willing and able. But typing it up or thinking about it also works. Okay, so the point of this exercise is that the way we talk to ourselves is often miles apart from how we might talk to somebody else. As somebody just commented, it's so much easier to be nice to a friend, right? And so why are we not friendly towards ourselves, right? Like that's and you know, we have just addressed the objections. Being friendly to ourselves doesn't make us less ambitious. It doesn't make us less you know, accomplish less or do less in the world. So that's why, you know, self-compassion is worth practicing. It can be really useful. So the goal here is to help move your own self-talk inside your head closer to how you would approach a friend. That's the whole point of self-compassion, or like a main point of it. And again, it's important, and I'll say this, to be self-compassionate as you try to do this, right? Because we don't want to get into this meta shame spiral where it's like, oh, not only am I shaming myself, but like then I'm shaming myself about shaming myself, and then more shame on that. And this is why it's a spiral. It's just, it doesn't lead anywhere good, let me tell you. So that's the idea with this, is that if we are kind to ourselves, we sort of interrupt that shame spiral so that we can just take action and move forward. Okay, so words to look out for are like should or shouldn't, have to, bad, not something enough, not good enough, not smart enough, not talented enough, that sort of thing. These are words to look out for, judgmental words, and you might move towards somebody shared something else, which is that self-flagellation as a motivation technique has its drawbacks. Indeed, it does. It can work in the short term, but in the long run, it has consequences. So here's some more affirming and empowering language you can use. And so here are some examples of that. This is a challenging situation. I just said oops, right? So this is a challenging situation. Changing slides, accidentally went ahead too fast. But this is a challenging situation. I've learned something. Next time I will choose this. This is an area for growth. I'd like to improve on, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, you know, once we've sort of calmed ourselves down through mindfulness, through being with our emotions and not trying to change them, but just being with them, sitting with them, feeling them, and then deciding what actions we want to move forward. But it's important to use this affirming and empowering language rather than the judgment, the harsh judgments. And so that's the goal here. Okay, and so then the other side of self-compassion, which is explored too in the Mindful Self-Compassion workbook, is this idea of self-appreciation. And it's kind of that self-compassion is often useful. Compassion is sort of bound up with the idea of suffering, so mistakes, failure, that sort of thing, whereas self-appreciation kind of takes when you've done well and helps, you know, amplify that and give yourself appreciation, but from a humble place of recognizing that where you are successful and accomplish things, so are others. And so that's part of being a human, is bringing gifts to the world. And so it's this self-appreciation is sort of a humble way of appreciating things about yourself. And this is important. So Bell Hooks in All About Love says that many jobs undermine self-love because they require that workers constantly prove their worth. And I mention this because, you know, I said I wasn't going to dwell on some of the outside forces, but I will mention that a lot of times when we're feeling imposter syndrome or when we're feeling stress at work, it is because of these forces that are out there. And so, you know, like Bell Hooks talks about here, which is that, you know, we're constantly being forced to prove our worth. I mean, I think part of the reason tech interviews are so demoralizing, why they have made me cry when I used to do them in the past, is that there's sort of just this like, prove that I should hire you, prove that you're worthy, you know, and it's just your self-worth gets tied up into it, and it can be really stressful. And so again, because I can't solve all of that right here, I just want to assure you though that you have innate worth as a human being, no matter what. And that's just there. You have value, you have worth, and you don't have to prove that. You know, there are things that you may want to accomplish, there are goals you're going to set, but you have innate worth right now as a human being. And so if no one's told you that in a while, it's true. Okay, so here's an exercise in self-appreciation. So what qualities can you appreciate about yourself? So what do you feel that you do strongly? When was the last time you could just remember one time that you did something you were proud of? And again, it's from this humble place of like, that was something that helped people. That was something where I helped my team, or I accomplished something. I alleviated a little bit of suffering for somebody in this moment. Something like that. So what self-appreciation can you practice in this moment? So think back on that, and I'll be quiet for a few minutes just so you can think about something that you like that you did, or a quality that you have, either way. Okay, I'm going to cut it a little short just because for time. But I will say I did this exercise with a group of kids that I used to teach coding to, and they shared out, and it was really exciting to hear them like share their, what they were proud of and what they accomplished. And when I do this sort of thing live, like even with adults, it's great to share it because people don't often do that. So it's kind of nice. Um, okay, and then another aspect of this is I would say keep track of a lot of these things in a smile file, which I've talked about before in various places. But it's a good way to deal with imposter syndrome. It's sort of acquiring this evidence of how awesome you are. Again, I say that you'll do it from a humble place, but you know what I mean. Of like things you've done, things people have complimented you on, things that you've helped people with. I like to keep track of thank you notes because those are some of the most beautiful things to me. Like when somebody writes a thank you note, it just warms my heart every time. And so keep track of these things. This can help too with our sense of self-worth. Okay, so we'll talk about setting boundaries. Again, I'll move quickly just because for some reason, I guess a lot of times in my talks, I talk really fast. And this one, believe it or not, I've talked a little bit more slowly, which means now I'm going to speed it up a little to get through these slides. But anyway, okay, so taking a break from the news, it does not mean that you're burying your head in the sand. So this is another way to set a boundary because again, it's important to stay informed, absolutely, especially those of us that do have power to make changes. It's important we stay informed about what's going on in the world, about what we can do. However, we don't have to be on 24/7 watching this. And if we do, again, we're likely to burn out. So there's a lot of people want to see it's either or, like either you're informed or you bury your head in the sand. But really, there's like a spectrum here, and you need to find what works for you and set that boundary for yourself. Even if people try to make you feel guilty for doing that, just remember you're setting that boundary. Along with that, how to say no. So check in with your core values. And that's a whole thing, coming to your core values. But that's an exercise worth doing because that helps you decide whether or not you want to say no in a situation. Another way to find out is a good test is if I knew this person wouldn't be angry, disappointed, or upset, would I say no? And that helps you know if you actually want to do something or not. And that will help decide whether or not you say no. And so here's the technique on saying no that I like. And again, this might not apply to every situation, but it's sort of like, I was like, oh, this is a nice way that I've never heard no talked about before. Whenever you notice you're about to say no, to turn down a request, to correct or reprimand someone, resolve to say no clearly and to appreciate and respect the other person. Then communicate your no while feeling love in your heart. And that doesn't mean that you have to agree with the person, and it doesn't mean that you have to say that to the person. And that love may more be directed towards yourself. But I like this idea that no can be said firmly and directly, but that inside you know it's coming from a self-protective, a self-compassionate place. Okay, and then the bigger picture here with self-compassion is finding meaning. So when you find your core values and allow those to inform your goals, that will help you find meaning. And so that's an element of self-compassion too. The idea is, the trick is to not get too attached to the outcome. Another way to find meaning in this very challenging moment is to realize that our pain can become an education in compassion. So the suffering that we feel is never going to be the same as what other people feel. But when we open our hearts to our own suffering, we're able to potentially open our hearts to at least acknowledge suffering in others, even if we're never fully able to understand it because they have a different life experience. So Thich Nhat Hanh has this thing that he talks about, this idea of no mud, no lotus, which is that lotus, this beautiful flower, grows from mud underneath. And so whatever mud we're dealing with, it's necessary in this moment in order to have the lotus. So this healing we're going through as a world, it's necessary. So self-compassion, to summarize, self-compassion is not selfish. It actually provides a strong foundation so that we can help others. Some techniques we talked about: supportive self-talk, keeping a smile file, doing mindfulness breaks, setting firm boundaries, reflecting on your core values, that is like underlying all of this, and then having that sense of purpose. So protect your self-compassion practices. And I say that because that means sometimes you don't have to broadcast all of them. So you might not broadcast when you're taking a break from social media, because then people may judge you for that, and then it sort of kind of counteracts. It's counterproductive to the whole idea of practicing self-compassion, because then you're going to deal with more judgment. So do what you need to do to take care of yourself, and try to shield it a bit from the judgment of others, so that you can come back stronger and able to dive back in and do these things. So that's just a quick note. I like this idea of we can get in a rhythm, internal and external, back and forth, quiet the mind, tend to the world. So it's a balance. We go back and forth. Another quote, I couldn't decide which quote to end on, so I just threw in a bunch. Another one from Toni Morrison. This is a great one. I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it is important not to ignore its pain, it is also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. And so this means is, like I said, we're not burying our heads in the sand here. What we're trying to do is cultivate that inner resilience so that we have the strength and enough hope so that we can keep going. Karen Armstrong, again, another quote. Do not be overwhelmed by the immensity of the task ahead, because it is possible to change attitudes. Every person in the street can become a force for good in the world. And I think I find a lot of inspiration in this because, we're being flooded with a lot of the problems, but every human being has that power that we talked about, that personal power. And so I still have a lot of hope. Okay, so thank you. Got a little bit over time, but like 1 minute, so not too bad. So thank you. And here's some resources for continuing your journey. Some books and a website and Compassionate Coding. I haven't put out a newsletter in a long time. Some of you who subscribe probably know this. So I may start that back up again soon. And if I do, I'm hoping to announce through that list to a course that I'm working on that sort of has more detail about this, because like I said, we're just kind of scratching the surface here. But yeah, so if there are questions, if people want to stick around, I'll be here for a little while to answer questions. And there is a Q&A here. There's like, you can submit questions through like a little Q&A thing. So if you want to, feel free to do that. The questions that were submitted ahead of time, I tried to kind of work into the talk. So yeah, but thank you for everybody who's joining. And I know some of you will probably have to pop off. And I believe this recorded, so I should be able to share a recording. But I'm not sure, this is my first time using this exact setup. So hopefully it all worked out, but we'll see. And again, thank you for joining and thank you for caring about all of this and for being a part of this change and thank you for surviving everything going on right now. And seriously, you deserve a lot of compassion and just for being, and just so I hope you know that. Yeah, so any questions, feel free. Okay, let's see. In tech specifically, how do you deal with calibrating yourself against your peers? Do you have certain techniques for preventing comparison? So that's a good idea. And I think one of them is just realizing, it's kind of in the question about preventing comparison. So realizing that we are on our own journeys. So some people's journey includes just focusing on writing code or doing their work all the time, and they love it, and that's their life, and that's just all they want. I personally found that was not enough for me just to write code. I loved writing code, but I also wanted to do other things. I wanted to play music, for example, or I wanted to cultivate interest. I wanted to do some volunteer work. Like I like doing that sort of stuff. I wanted to interact with people. I wanted to do all this. And so I'm on a different journey. And so it doesn't really make sense to compare these two journeys. Is one reason. Another reason is that we all start from different places, and this is why that whole meritocracy thing is a myth, is that we all start from different places. So you're comparing yourself starting from wherever you did with somebody who started in a totally different place, and so that's another reason comparison doesn't work. So I guess I use these logical things to tell myself why comparison doesn't work. It's kind of like sometimes when I'm out running, so I love to run, but I'm like a really slow runner. And so when I'm out running, sometimes a lot of people will pass me, like all kinds of people will pass me. And like, I try not to compare myself because it's like, we're not in a race. Like, I'm not trying to beat anyone. I'm just trying to run to stay in shape. And so I think there's that too, is that like, just because we do live in a competitive society, it's very true, but it's our choice whether we give into that all of the time or whether we do what we need to in order to function in this kind of flawed society, or whether we let that drive our whole lives and live competitively all the time. And so I think that we have a choice in that matter. And so I think I just make these logical arguments with myself for why the comparison is invalid, because there's so many different variables at play. That was a good question, though. And so self-compassion comes into play there too, right? Because part of why we're in different places is because of things, our own suffering that we've gone through, which is different from what they've gone through. And then once you get to that, you can honestly start to feel happy for people who have accomplished things that you strive to, because then you realize we're all part of this common humanity. And I know it sounds like touchy-feely, whatever, but there are moments where you can get to that and you're like, oh, that's really great that they did that. Like, I can probably do that too. And it can be this positive thing. Another thing too is, remember, social media is a very filtered lens. I'll just throw that in there. And so, I, for example, might post about, happy things online sometimes. I don't always post pictures of like Oreo crumbs in my bathtub when I'm like crying and eating cookies in the bathtub. So sad, right? Like, I'm not going to put a picture of that on Twitter or on Instagram. And so that happens, right? And so I think that because we're only seeing like this, a certain lens of what people are talking about, that I think, it's important to keep that in mind too in comparisons. Some people say like you're comparing your inside to other people's outside. There's something to that. Or that like you're starting out with the ingredients for a cake and you're comparing it to somebody's like finished cake, that sort of thing. Okay, another question. How much should we let others know that we are now practicing self-compassion and will be acting a bit more consciously, not necessarily being so open to offer help all the time? Wouldn't it be compassionate to let others know? This is a good question. Okay, so like I said, we want to protect our practice. So you don't, and that means different things to different people. So some environments, somebody mentioned too in a different question that was submitted about being in a passive aggressive environment. And so in those, you're not going to get much support for talking about self-compassion. They even get ridicule. So depending on your environment, it depends on the level of support that you're likely to get for talking about this sort of thing. But even in those environments, or in any environments, you just sort of can set the boundaries without telling them it's about self-compassion necessarily. Meaning, and it's, again, you're not concealing anything. It's not about that. It's more just like framing it in a way where they can understand it and appreciate it. So if it's because you have other projects that you're working on and you need to set a boundary, that you're not able to help out as much, or that you can only help out from these hours to these hours, you can say it in a broad way, like, what, I'm starting to reset how I do my scheduling, and so these are the hours where I'm going to be available for questions, and other times I'm going to be doing heads down work, right? So I too, like some of you who may have tried to contact me in the past, like sometimes I get really behind on emails and direct messages on Twitter, especially. To be honest, I think there's some direct messages on Twitter from like years ago that I haven't responded to. And it's not because they're not important to me. It's that it's overwhelming. And so, when I do get back, when I'm able to get back with people, I usually mention, that I have been taking a break, or I've been, so I let them know. And so I do share that. And so I think it's, it depends on your situation, but it can be, I do think it's important to let people know if it affects them, but you don't always have to say it's because of self-compassion, because like I said, some people will just laugh at you. People laugh at me all the time for talking about this stuff, and I'm used to it, but not everybody, feels that way. So great question. It's compatible when it's going to affect them. Okay. Any other questions? Thank you, everybody who stayed too. So it's really wonderful to have you here. And feel free to email me if something comes up later. It's April@compassionatecoding.com. And I, as I just mentioned, it may take me a while to get back. So hopefully you'll have compassion for that. But I do welcome the questions, and I apologize to anyone who has contacted me and if you're awaiting a response. I really do hope that someday I'll be able to get back with everyone, but we will see. We will see. Okay. Well, I am going to call it then. Thank you so much for being here, and I encourage you to keep practicing compassion for yourself and others, and stay in touch, and take care, and stay safe. Take care of yourselves and the people in your lives, and thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Oh, thank you all. You're so sweet. You're sending the sweetest messages. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Bye-bye.